Hey, now joining me now from the UK is Will Kingston, host of the Spectator Australia's Fire at Will podcast. Will, great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining me tonight here. I've just been speaking here about the social cohesion problems that we have in the US and in Australia and different sort of ways that's manifesting themselves. But I wanted to talk to you about this other story, which I found really disturbing out of the UK, where Prevent, which is an anti-terror government body, has decided now that people who are conservatively minded, on the right, and who believe things that are of the sort of thing that a lot of people who are watching the show probably think sounds perfectly sensible, like Western culture is under threat from mass migration and lack of integration. Well, that people like this are somehow threats, bigger threats, and should somehow be re-educated. Will, tell me about this and what's going on here in Britain, because didn't the Prime Minister Keir Starmer say something very similar to this the other day when he said the nation was becoming an island of strangers?
Yes, he did, in one of the most cynical plays that I can recall from a politician, given that he's been an open borders, multiculturalism advocate for his entire career. James, it is interesting, and it gets me thinking about this "have we reached the end of woke" conversation. I'm speaking to Andrew Doyle tomorrow. He's saying that we have reached the end of woke. Piers Morgan's got a book out saying pretty much the same thing. My argument would be I don't think we are, because you look at bodies like this, these sorts of quangos, these semi-governmental organisations. Even if the politicians like Keir Starmer start saying the bleeding obvious, that multiculturalism has failed, in fact, it hasn't worked wherever it's been tried, and I include Australia in that, you still have this layer of the bureaucracy in dark corners of Westminster or in Canberra that will continue to push this sort of ideology, often outside of the view of the politicians. And this is why I think, particularly as we look to the future, we've got to start thinking about that sort of administrative layer that sits in Canberra, that sits in the US, that sits in the UK, that will keep pushing this sort of divisive stuff, because they're still committed to it, even if the politicians are now realising, particularly in the UK, that this multicultural ideology is electorally toxic.
Well, and it's really funny, Will, because this sort of thing, this sort of thinking manifests itself in so many ways. And I mean, it's Sunday night, so we should have a little bit of lightheartedness here, at least Sunday night here. But there was a story that just shows how the sort of the rot of all of this sort of thing, this sort of thinking goes, and how deep it goes. It touches everything. The Michelin guides, the restaurant guide that gives you star ratings, and all the chefs want them. Everyone wants to go to the Michelin-starred restaurants. Well, now they're being urged to decolonize and being told that they're racist. And I also thought this was pretty funny for an organization that rates restaurants that generally cost like $500 or $1,000 a head to go to. They're being accused of being elitist. I mean, tell me about this.
Yeah, welcome to another edition of What's Racist This Week. And these sorts of stories, they pop up every week now. Diets are racist, or punctuality is racist, or climate change is racist. And whenever these stories pop up, I do think, how can someone's psychology bring them to such a silly argument? And the best answer I can come to is for radical identity politics leftists. Race and identity politics more generally is the only prism through which they see the world. So they naturally assume that other people must only see the world through that lens. It's an entirely monocausal way of looking at things. And we don't live in a monocausal world. Like, there is a completely obvious alternative explanation here. And that is, the Michelin Guide doesn't operate in places like Africa or India or in Australia, I might add, because those tourism boards haven't forked out the money in order for Michelin to establish themselves there. But the left doesn't see it that way. It has to be racism. It can't be an alternative. So whenever I have this conversation with one of these Fruit Loops, the first thing is, you will just ask, are there any other alternative explanations for why this is happening as opposed to racism? And look, they probably won't change their views, but at least you've tried to do everything you possibly can to try and get them to think in a more logical way.